So yeah, I was asked by Volker and the other organizers to give a kind of recapitulation about what happened at the first conference of this two-conference package back in October when we were at this wonderful place near this lake and the mountains. Fantastic setting. Now this is not working really. Okay, maybe we have to turn it on. No, it's on. All right. So, so this was a conference that had a kind of focus on the second half of the third millennium, focused especially on the Bell Beaker phenomenon, but not only. It was organized in 6 sessions, very similar to the setup that it is here. And I will focus on 5 themes from these sessions, themes like the origins, the beginning of the Bell Beaker phenomenon, the variability, regional variability, kind of content, what's behind the Bell Beaker phenomenon, if there is anything behind it actually, how to characterize Bell Beaker related societies, and of course the impact of ADNA, the genetic transformation that we see and what that makes with our narratives. So let's start with the first theme. I will try to also give a little, mention the speakers, and I think I have more or less gotten everybody. And if I have forgotten something, that is, of course, something that I would hope people not take personal. So the question about beginnings was tackled in the beginning of the conference, actually, by our Portuguese colleagues, Maria de Jesus Sanchez and João Luís Cardoso, who talked about and discussed this evidence for Bell Beaker pottery that dates, according to some C14 dates, to the time already around 2700 BCE. And this is actually a controversial topic. And it was controversially discussed also in this conference because, as you can see, it's not that many dates. The context can, of course, always be questioned, and it was questioned on the conference. I think there needs to be done, we need more dates actually to confirm this kind of idea that this pottery style develops earlier in Portugal than it does anywhere else. In any case, I think we are mostly talking here about, let's say an earlier beginning of a pottery style, and then of course we still have to ask the question, what does that actually mean for the understanding, the overall understanding of the Bell Beaker phenomenon, especially also that Volker Heid showed. We can also go to the other side of the distribution in the Rhine Basin. We also have earlier dates here than the average dates that we find in other places. Quentin showed yesterday what you actually can do with systematic modeling. But in any case, what Volker showed is that in this Rhine Basin, you have very early maritime beakers, and this is probably the place where this kind of merging of Bell Beaker material culture with genetic step ancestry seems to somehow start. That's at least what Volker was showing. And this would actually then make a very complicated origin story for this whole phenomenon, because we have this kind of different directions which are merging in somehow. There is reference that could be made to Edward Sangmeister's reflux theory, as it was also referenced by Ralf Grossmann at the Riva conference. So much for the beginning. So you see I'm coming to some certain topics in a relatively fast manner, but we will be a little more concentrated in the later part of the talk. The second theme was that about regional developments. And what I will show you now is, not so surprisingly, rather heterogeneous stories for every single region that was dealt with at the conference. So Olivier Lemercier, for example, discussed and showed the southern French material, the Rhone Valley especially, and he could show how Bell Beaker materials are slowly integrated into late Neolithic assemblages, and only in the later period of Bell Beakers then the Bell Beaker material takes over as such, and then the late Neolithic traditions more or less disappears, and this continues into the Bronze Age. This is a very, very different picture than Ana Catarina Basilio and Pilar Prieto Martinez showed for different places in the Iberian Peninsula, where you actually have a rather selective presence of Bell Beaker pottery in some sites, while you have a total absence of Bell Beaker pottery in other sites. So it seems to be a situation where you have a conscious adoption or a conscious rejection of these kind of objects. In the Adria regions, a number of colleagues talked about Franco Nicolis, Stasio Vornbacher, Maya Gori, Giulia Reccia, Elisabetta Bordnia, all talked about different, let's say, interactions of Bell Beaker material with contemporary styles that are not Bell Beaker. So how is the relation of those Bell Beaker materials to styles and communities such as Cetina, Ljubljana culture, and even also the Aegean Bronze Age? Ralf Grossmann discussed the situation in central Germany, where we have this kind of interesting interplay and also complex interplay between corded ware and Bell Beaker pottery styles and also burial rituals. And this is also the region, as we I just talked about a little earlier, where you also seem to have this kind of split off of some genetic lineages, as it seems, from corded ware realm, then constituting Bell Beakers later. So it's a very interesting kind of dialectic relationship, as it was called in the 1950s by Ulrich Fischer. Dialectic relationship between Bell Beakers and corded ware, where they're actually doing the same thing, but slightly different. And it seems to be intentionally different. Going to Ireland, Neil Carlin again showed a very different situations where Bell Beakers are mostly found in settlements, where the typical burial assemblage is missing, but then, to make up for that more or less, you have a strong connection to copper metallurgy, where daggers are deposited in large numbers and even some gold artifacts appear. Mike Parker Pearson talked about the British material. Here, again, it's a very interesting situation. We know from the archaeology and also from genetics it's a very sudden change, a very sudden start of Bell Beakers shortly after 2500 BC. And what you then see is that the Bell Beaker people related to Bell Beaker phenomena are not anymore associated with these large communal building projects like Stonehenge, even if they are present in the region. On the other hand, you do have, for example, such communal projects like Woodhenge, like Silbury Hill, that are still being constructed and worked at the time when Bell Beaker is already around. So there is a kind of duality of communities, as it seems, also when it comes to these kind of monuments and monumental building projects. Mike Parker Pearson also showed the results of his strontium isotope analysis, and he pointed to a relatively high proportion of mobile people, so around an average of 40% of non-locals in every assemblage in Britain that he looked at. Although this is a small-scale mobility, mostly confined to the British region, and it is also really not much more than before, so it's actually a continuation. This kind of behavior is a continuation of the Neolithic behavior. It's not really something out of the ordinary, even if it looks very high with 40%. And then there are these exceptional individual long-distance movers, which are probably the ones who you can see as a kind of pioneers for getting this kind of Bell Beaker package into Britain, like the Amesbury Archer. But this continues over many centuries. It's not only at the beginning. So we come now to two talks, Wolfgang Haag and Alisa Mitnick, who also integrate DNA and ADNA and archaeology into their presentation of regional groups. And this was Wolfgang Haag, who referred to mostly the Papach et al. Paper, where he pointed to this very weird, in a way, or strange situation that you have this very strong both cultural and genetic segregation between corded ware and Bell Beaker, or Bell Beaker and everybody else, basically, in Bohemia, which, as you can see here from the, I think this at least works, you can see it from the Y chromosome haplotypes, where the Bell Beakers form a very distinct group here, which is not mixing anymore after 2500 with other groups, especially not corded ware, even if they are closely related to each other. But this is a big contrast towards the first half of the third millennium in Bohemia, where there is a large genetic diversity in early corded ware. And this seems then to change in the late third millennium. And then Alisa Mitnick discussed the Italian material and showed how, if you look at the different Bell Beaker contexts all over Italy, you find a huge variability in the step ancestry proportion in all of these regions. Most significantly, I think, in southern Italy and in Sicily, the first step ancestry is really only coming in at the end of the third millennium, and it becomes prevalent only in the second millennium, so very late. Okay, the third theme that I want to talk about is the theme, what is actually behind the Bell Beaker phenomenon, if there is something. And I think this was part of the discussion. Volker Heydt proposed that there is something. He proposed that one could see the Bell Beaker phenomenon as an expression of a religion, referring to, for example, the relatively frequent appearance of kind of sun symbols or other celestial signs, which, if you link this to what we know about Mesopotamian and Egyptian religions, makes sense, and also the kind of standardized burial rites, I think is something that you could think of as being an expression of a more formalized, institutionalized form of belief system, something we could talk about as a religion. And I think that makes a lot of sense, at least maybe not for the whole phenomenon, but for some certain parts of the phenomenon, and I think it's something that's very much worth discussing. Mark van der Linden had a very different kind of approach to explain how we come up, how this kind of super-regional system of similar objects and similar practices emerged. It comes more from this kind of interaction theory approach, where he would argue that this similarity appears as a function of frequent interaction, rather than having some kind of uniform ideology or belief system behind it. He referred to the concept of homophily from Axelrod, which means that, or which uses the kind of observation that when people interact with each other, when people who have certain cultural similarities interact with each other, they tend to somehow create and develop more and more similarity through aligning their habits and their kind of cultural preferences. He combined this with considerations about collective action or collective action theory, arguing that also politics, social norms, and shared beliefs could then be aligned in such a kind of way. Very different approach than Volker's, but also something that is, I think, worth thinking about. And then as a third approach to explain what's behind the Bell Beaker phenomenon came from Carsten Wenting, who is at least also here today, like Volker, by the way, I think you know that. So Carsten has, and this is work coming out of his PhD, published in 2020, where he argued, and I think it's a very fascinating kind of out-of-the-box way of thinking, not always emphasizing this kind of warrior ideology behind Bell Beakers, but rather looking at the kind of assemblage that you see in these burials. And there are these beakers, there is the archer's equipment, there is small kind of tools, a dagger. And he argued quite convincingly, in my view, that this is exactly what the earliest traveler that we know of, the Iceman Ötzi, what he basically carried with him when he was crossing the Alps. And he argues that you could think of this kind of Bell Beaker phenomenon as a kind of material expression of an, super-regional system of travelers and hospitality, where they would use specific symbols to signal the possibility to come when you're traveling, to be welcome, to get a drink, and all these things with people who are somehow part of this kind of super-regional social group, like Esperanto maybe, or something like this in the more modern period. So I think also a very interesting question to think about. So all in all, I think it was an interesting debate about very different ways of conceiving or conceptualizing what actually could be behind Bell Beakers. The first option that we saw is, okay, there is a kind of set of shared ideas or related practices, maybe even institutions like a religion or something like this, that could be responsible for this kind of unification of material culture all over the western part of Europe. Or it could also be the tools themselves. That would be Carsten Wenting, the kind of properties of those tools, this kind of beaker, alcohol drinking, or this kind of hospitality, that somehow do then motivate certain parts of behaviors, leading to this kind of homogenization of certain elements that you can see across Europe. And the third is, as van der Linden was talking about, goes also, I think, in the direction of what Quentin Bourgeois showed yesterday, that we have rather a kind of emergence of patterns through frequent interaction. Okay, how to characterize Bell Beaker-related societies? That was the next big theme. We had several talks by Marie Bess, Eve de Rennes, and Quentin Favrel, who were showing results from pottery technology studies, which is, of course, a much underused source of information when it comes to traditions, social traditions, and their interactions in local, regional, and also trans-regional settings. And what they could show, and it seemed to align quite well, in both Switzerland and in France, is that you tend to have quite a diversity of different pottery or potters' technology traditions in the early part of Bell Beakers, and then a kind of homogenization over time, which would speak for some kind of, situation where all the different elements of Bell Beakers would not form a kind of initial package, but rather be things coming together at one point and then homogenizing, which is a little opposite to the kind of standard model where we think we have an initial idea which then spreads out. Yeah, Gus Kronen was also here today. Yeah, there you are. Talked about, which is a very relevant and important question, what language these people might have been speaking. He argued that, the Bell Beaker phenomenon has not really been, appreciated enough as a possible, carrier of, for example, and you can correct me if I say it wrong because I'm not so knowledgeable in this part, that you could very well, or he made a point that basically this kind of Italo-Celtic sub-branch could be something that is spread by Bell Beakers in the same way as maybe Germano-Baltic Slavic is something that could be associated with Bell Beaker according to the distribution patterns. Then gender roles is something that Eni Soriano brought in, and I thought it was, in a way, quite interesting that this, gender discussion hasn't really reached the third millennium Bell Beaker Coordinate discussion as much as you would expect it, given the kind of prevalence of this topic in the social sciences in general. So Eni Soriano was trying to make this point that we actually should be a little more investigative when it comes to gender roles in the third millennium. The kind of idea of a binary model being, what really characterizes the third millennium is very dominant. Robin Harris, for example, argued that this is the time basically when this very strong binary gender model is established in Eurasia, and this is the beginning of our way of looking at gender. However, Eni argued that you should question, this kind of binary, and you should look more into the kind of variations that there are, because everybody also knows that there are deviations, but they are not really explored as something that might be a kind of a relevant and interesting phenomenon. And what he was showing is that, as we know, the binary gender scheme does exist empirically. So that's very clear, but there is, of course, also quite frequent crossings of the binary gender model when it comes to the biological sex and the cultural gender in the burials. And it is very clear that it's mostly women who are able to cross this, while the male social roles seem to be much more fixed. And he was then making the point that one should also, look more closely at this and argue that it probably means that that women in that time were actually much more flexible when it came to their gender expression than men actually were. Then a very important point to me too is the male warrior paradigm. This is something which was discussed quite intensely. and what also shook me very much, I have to say. The male warrior paradigm in the third millennium is, I think, the most commonly accepted of all these kind of different elements of social organization in the third millennium. And it has to do with the prevalence of shaft-hole axes in male corded ware burials. So now we are going a little more to the whole third millennium. And then, of course, dagger, bow, and arrow in the Bell Beaker set, and is always seen as clearly we are talking here about warriors. That's very clear. Association of these weapons with male burials. But then again, Carsten Wenting showed that the useware analysis that he had performed on these axes, I have one here that he gave me, he borrowed to me, useware analysis from corded ware battle axes or shaft-hole axes, did all kinds of things, as you can see, smashing in pigs' heads and trying to chop down trees. They didn't leave this kind of useware that you have on a lot of those axes. What did leave this kind of useware is that when you use them for uprooting trees. So basically, it's a kind of combination of cutting into wood, earth, and gravel. So, I think this, for me, I always thought, okay, these are clearly weapons, but the kind of strange Dutch farmers, they somehow misuse them for something else. That was how I often then, for many years after I read his PhD, took it. But after his talk, and also in the kind of discussions in Riva, it was really something, he made a lot of good arguments, especially, having this thing in your hand, you realize, this is also the length of this shaft is something that is coming from an archaeological find. So this is how they look like. They are ergonomically not really practical for fighting. It's much too heavy here on the top, and a very, very thin and long shaft that doesn't really make any sense. And we have also seen that, at least these Dutch ones, they have not been used for that. Also, chopping down trees doesn't really work very well. It's not practical. So this is really something that we should think about. I mean, especially if you think about those incidences we have in the third millennium of violence. Mostly other tools are used to kill people than these kind of battle axes. If they would be the kind of weapon that everybody is, shown with in the burial, why do they use other things than other implements usually to kill? I mean, Anna Thornberg showed yesterday I was happy for that at least, okay, there is evidence that they have been used, but in most cases other implements are used, like flat axes or these kind of pig axes, arrowheads, of course. So this is really interesting, and we really have to ask our questions, why do we think that these things are weapons? We think that these are weapons, of course, because we think they are status symbols, and we see this association with male burials, which makes sense. But then, still, why do they have to be weapons? I mean, yeah, they are associated with male burials. They're also shown on stelae in combination with other tools like daggers and halberds, which we also think are weapons, and I think they are weapons. But still, it doesn't mean that, being shown together with weapons, you also have to be a weapon. And anyway, I mean, couldn't also the kind of male cultivator who is clearing the fields be a high status function in an agricultural society who just invented the plow, and where this idea to get rid of these trunks is very, very important? I mean, this is the kind of material basis of wealth in the Neolithic, and having a kind of specialized agricultural tool as a status symbol, I think it's at least something we have to think about, especially since the tradition of association of these shaft-hole axes with male burials is something that clearly comes out of an agricultural context. I mean, here in Alchonic, this is of course already Copper Age, but already in the late Neolithic you have this association of shaft-hole axes with male burials in a period where we are clearly dealing with a very agricultural society, and I think it is, and also you don't have this kind of high degrees of violence being attested. So I think it's at least something worth thinking about, why we actually think these are weapons. Maybe they are not weapons. Maybe the whole male warrior paradigm falls apart. I was very amazed also to see the talk from Dennis Topal, who was also still here, I hope, on, what was it, Wednesday, where he actually showed that weapons in Yamnaya burials are extremely seldom. Even if you take away the shaft tool axis, they might be even less than 5%. The signs of violence are also very seldom. So this is not a warrior, a warlike society. So this kind of stereotypical male, Yamnaya male warrior from the internet is a pop culture fantasy. But of course he is there because he has a lot of plot armor, because he features in this kind of very important idea about, steppe warriors or young youth warrior bands and all these things, which of course, have all their plausibility. But we could also frame it differently, and I think especially Yamnaya is, I think, something that needs to be thought about when it comes to, warrior or not warrior. And then also we can go, of course, back to the Bell Beakers. And if the warrior is not so clearly prominent, we could also see this Bell Beaker equipment. If it's not a traveler's equipment, it could also be a hunter's equipment, or hunter's equipment could be very handy when you are traveling. Instead of weapons, I mean, especially also since some of the daggers are extremely small, and also the kind of degrees of violence in Bell Beaker contexts, as we have seen, it's rather low. Parker Pearson showed for Britain that we have a lower rate of signs of violence. I mean, you talked about it, how it's, of course, not the best measure, of course, but as long as we have this, it doesn't look as if there is a kind of uptick in violence in Bell Beaker, in the British Isles, and also not in the continental, or like, say, France. Germany, Peter Röcher also doesn't show that, and as we saw from Dennis Topal, Yamnaya also doesn't. Okay. This is one point. The second point, which I think is interesting, is the point of patrilocality when it comes to social organization. Also something we need to think about more thoroughly. There is also a kind of consensus now, especially through this paper, but also others. Rögren, I mean, it's Christiansen, you are the last author here, aren't you? Yeah. And Volker. So patrilocality is something that is more or less a consensus now. It has been attested through a lot of different methods. For example, a comparison of the variability of Y chromosome haplotypes and mtDNA haplotypes, so representing the kind of male versus female kind of variability, genetic variability, and of course strontium isotopes. And I think there are two problems with this, which we need to discuss more thoroughly, I think. One, I think that the question of what is being asked usually in this paper and in others is whether patrilocality exists. And I think this is a too narrow question, as Bradley Enzo has shown in his book here, The Not Very Patrilocal European Neolithic, which gives away his main idea already. It's not so much that, it's not factually wrong to say that the data would indicate patrilocality, but the problem is that it could also indicate a lot of other things. It could indicate, as he, for example, argues, neolocality or bilocality or a lot of other patterns of residence, rules of residence after marriage. And I also think that there is a kind of low threshold for confirmation when it comes to patrilocality. So you have a few more mobile females and males, and you say, okay, that looks like patrilocality. And I think it's something we need to look a little more closely into. And then, of course, you should not identify patrilocality with patriarchy or the kind of male-dominated system as something that Kate Freeman and colleagues have argued. I also think there is a kind of lack of interest in female identities when it comes to the third millennium, cordetware, Bell Beakers. They're usually attested a rather passive role, or they are not really discussed the kind of variability of female roles. I think Louise Ohlerud is one of the exceptions here, which I think should give a kind of role model for how you should also look more closely into the social role of women in the past. Okay, last point, the genetic transformation. 9 years ago, this really changed almost everything we thought about the third millennium. Here is a citation from Haag et al. Our genetic data provide direct evidence of migration and suggest that it was relatively sudden. And the point that was discussed in Riva was the question of the suddenness and what that actually means. In the popular literature, it was argued, for example, that we have this is the bridge situation where the Beaker impact comes in with a step ancestry, and you have this total flip of genetic profiles in just a few centuries, as it is said here. And then the question is, for archaeologists, what does it mean? Does it really mean that the people were wiped out or something like this? You know, here is the evidence. It's a very clear evidence, I think. But the question is, how can you actually explain this archaeologically? I think you know, such a kind of wiping out of population is something that, of course, we know happens. But I would like to see more dead bodies in order to make this point. I don't think that you know, there are these kind of mass graves and this kind of mass killings that we can test for, but I think it's not enough for the whole of Europe, and definitely also we don't have it, as I've already shown, in the British Isles. And also Mike Parker Pearson made the point that we have to always keep in mind that the burial evidence that we are dealing with, from which the genetic evidence usually comes, of course, is not a kind of representative sample of population, but rather a very unrepresentative sample of the population. It is a few % of a living population, which is clearly very socially selective. And thus, we have to always assume that you know, such very abrupt changes just would somehow, and they do correlate, of course, with changes in the burial ritual. So there are new forms of burial reserved for certain kinds of people. And in that way, of course, we cannot assume that this switch here really represents the real switch in population that is that sudden as it seems here. And then Ian Armitt made a kind of calculation which just somehow trying to give a little context here. This genetic transformation, which is so clearly shown up in these burials, works quite well. So it's a 93% exchange in the genetic code, but it actually works quite well without any kind of mass extermination or anything. If you assume that you have two populations, it's just a theoretical assumption, but to illustrate this, you have, let's say, in 300 years, which is a reasonable, you know, relatively sudden. This is relatively sudden in an archaeological point of view. In 12 generations, you have the difference between 1.8 to 2.2 average surviving children per female. If you have this difference, you end up from two equal populations to 93 to 7%. And this is because we actually underestimate the kind of effect of different growth rates, for example. And if that is amplified over the generations, then we do underestimate the kind of the exponential nature of this effect that it can have. And you can go, you know, with a 2% annual growth rate, which is a lot, but it is something that happens in human populations. You go from 100 people to 51,000 people in about 300 years. Or with a 3.5%, which is something that's known in Africa, in recent societies, you would go from 100 people to 6.5 million in 300 years. And this means you can have total replacements of populations in 300 years, which is not without any kind of, you know, wiping out of the population. It might not even be something that people would recognize as happening actually in a kind of social sense. All right, I'm coming to the end. I'm summing up here. The main takeaways for me are as the beginning that I showed, Bell Beakers are integrated into social contexts in very different ways, and thus denote a whole lot of different things in different regions. So I would personally, I do accept this idea that in some instances a religion, an organized religion, could be responsible and could be also argued for being important here. But otherwise I would say that what we are dealing with is quite different societies who are interacting with each other and thus developing, or we have this emergence of cultural similarities coming out. That's a personal opinion, of course. My takeaway is that shaft-top axes are likely agricultural tools, and the idea of battle axes is now with a burden of proof. So we should do more user analysis in order to figure out what these tools actually are made of. Third, a little provocative here, the following elements of the main third millennium narrative are not supported by the data: patriarchy, warriorhood, elevated levels of violence, at least not across the board. I saw your talk yesterday. Strict binary gender roles, and this idea of mass migration as a kind of socially experienced reality in a very short time, like 1 or 2 generations. And then, not to be taken totally serious, I have a kind of alternative scenario about the 3rd millennium as such. So Yamnaya herders were, and that's shocking, not only males, but as Dennis Topal showed, it's more or less males and females, and maybe also other identities that we don't really know about because we don't really ask those questions. Instead of being warriors, they were a bunch of peace-loving hippies, mostly interested in the pleasant things of life, like their identities being expressed not through weapons, but through, let's say, nice clothes, ornaments, and beautiful hairs and hair ornaments, as we find in those burials. They tried horseback riding, but falling off the back of the horses, as Trautmann and colleagues have shown, they thus decided to stick to cattle-drawn wagons and went with them westwards. They went westwards when to their south kings, cities, and armies appeared, and they did what every sane person would do. They just dispersed into all directions possible, east and west, as fast as they could. And when they then came into the dense forests of the west, their adapted pastoralist lifestyle didn't really work anymore, and so they adopted the hard-working cultivator as their new social ideal, symbolized here through this agricultural tool, which is then cordetware, and further to the west, a subunit refrained to hunting and traveling as a more pleasant and less ardent lifestyle, being Bell Beakers. Thank you very much.